Most of us sit up straight and watch carefully when we see a slab avalanche release, especially a skier-triggered slab avalanche. The crown fracture zipping across the slope gets my attention every time. It's a tension fracture through the slab, but experienced avalanche practitioners disagree on these two questions. First, was there tension in the slab before the skier entered the start zone? And second, if there was tension, did it contribute to the slab avalanche? In the next 20 minutes or so, Karl Birkeland, Scott Thumlert, Grant Statham, and I are going to look for slab tension in the stages that researchers have identified. And we'll compare the science on slab tension with the perception of slab tension that comes from moving through avalanche terrain. In the summer of 2022, Scott Thumlert and I surveyed over 50 avalanche practitioners about tension in the slab. The full summary of responses is available here. About 75% of respondents said that when ski cuts are producing avalanches, there is tension in the slab before the skier entered the start zone. In the comments and in email messages, quite a few avalanche practitioners associated slab tension with preconditions that contribute to slab avalanche release. These include fast creep, the way the slab felt or a change in the properties of the slab. Some mention increasing slabbiness or cohesion of the slab, triggerable or almost triggerable, stiffer but not yet reactive, and others associate slab tension with avalanche release or crown fracture, fast or snappy propagation of the crown fracture, cracks, woofs, or slab avalanches at most breakovers. So slab tension means different things to different practitioners. Also, Karl, Scott, Grant, and I have changed our mind about slab tension during our careers. Jörg Schweitzer and colleagues have divided dry slab avalanche release into 4 stages: initial failure, onset of crack propagation, dynamic crack propagation, and slab release. To understand which of these stages involves slab tension, let's start with a shallow dive into the viscoelasticity of snow. The simplest model of viscoelasticity is based on a spring for the elastic part and dashpot or syringe for the viscous part. These are connected end to end and tension is applied. Tension is a force that tends to stretch an object. Of course, there's an equation for this simple model of viscoelasticity, but I prefer things I can fumble with. So I connected a real spring to a real syringe and pulled on it. First, I pulled on it slowly. The spring extended about 10 to 20% and the syringe gradually elongated over 7 seconds. The spring extension was limited, so the stored elastic energy was quite small. To see viscosity on a snow slope, here are toothpicks in a pit wall. Even though this clip shows 2 hours of deformation in 15 seconds, it looks viscous, not elastic. I can't imagine any of the deformation springing back if gravity stopped pulling on the snow. Next, I'm going to load the system in 1/3 of a second, about 20 times faster than the slow loading. Just in case you blinked, here is the fast loading in slow motion. In the first 1/3 of a second, the spring immediately stretches about 160%, storing elastic energy. In the same time, the syringe, which models viscous deformation, has not started to extend. When I stop extending the system, the syringe extends and the spring returns to its relaxed length. The elastic energy briefly stored in the spring is dissipated by the extension of the syringe. So when a viscoelastic material like snow is deformed slowly, the stored elastic energy is minimal. To produce substantial elastic energy, snow has to be deformed quickly. Let's look at the stages of dry slab avalanche release and focus on rider triggering. The moving rider stresses the upper snowpack, as shown by the red bulb. A brittle crack, shown in black, starts in the weak layer under the rider. If the crack is long enough, it propagates in the weak layer away from the trigger point. The crown and other boundaries of the slab fracture, and the slab slides down slope. Now let's look more closely at these stages. Starting at the top with a moving rider, the stress under the rider directly starts a brittle crack. To show the effect of rapid loading on the crack length required for propagation, Karl Birkeland used a version of the propagation saw test in his research.
I did some experiments where I added varying amounts of disaggregated snow to an existing snowpack, and I allowed this added snow to sinter for about an hour. The pre-existing snowpack had about 10 centimeters of low-density snow on top of the surface hoar layer. As you can see, adding snow shortened the critical crack length. Here we are adding 15 centimeters of snow, and the PST cut length was only 4 centimeters. And with 20 centimeters of snow added, you'll see that we just barely touch the weak layer with the saw, and we get a 2 centimeter critical crack length before we get propagation. So adding the snow created increasingly reactive conditions in a system that did not have any discernible slab tension until the weak layer crack began to propagate.
In videos of rider triggering, we can't see the crack in the weak layer. However, in this video, we see the stockwall fracture before the crown fracture, so we know the brittle crack in the weak layer propagated before the crown fractured. The propagating crack in the weak layer briefly creates tension in the slab, which drives crack propagation under the slab, and then the brittle crack through the slab, called the crown fracture. But this slab tension occurs at a late stage of dry slab avalanche release. It does not exist before the rider entered the start zone. Next, let's look at natural avalanche release. The snowpack conditions that favor natural avalanches also favor rider-triggered avalanches. Perhaps there is tension in these preconditions. To understand how natural slab avalanches release, let's start with creep on an avalanche slope. In this clip of fluffy snow creeping, watch the dot that starts inside the circle. Creep consists of settlement, shown by the green arrow, and shear, shown by the red arrow. For simplicity, let's focus on the shear. Any condition that will speed up creep will increase the shear rate in the upper weak layers. When weak layers shear faster, stability decreases and the critical crack length becomes shorter. As Karl mentioned, these conditions include rapid loading by snowfall or wind. Rapid warming, including sun on fresh dry snow, may also reduce the critical crack length, but the limited research suggests the warming effect on dry slabs is weaker than rapid loading. Weak layers creep faster than the slab or layer below the weak layer. When snow deforms, bonds break, shown by red dots, and new bonds form, shown by green dots. In the weak layer, the deformation, as well as the breaking and forming of bonds, is concentrated at the upper and lower boundaries of the weak layer, adjacent to the stiffer layers. For a natural slab avalanche, there must be more bonds breaking than forming, and in places, the breaking bonds will be close to one another. If the shear component of creep is fast enough, the damaged area will grow into a ductile failure zone, traditionally called a deficit zone. At this stage, deformation is slow and elastic energy in the slab above the failure zone is negligible. However, if the failure zone reaches a critical length, called the critical crack length, the crack will accelerate and propagate, which is the same as for rider triggering. At these latter stages, tension in the slab drives the brittle crack in the weak layer. So, looking at the early stages of natural avalanches, we identified conditions that increase creep and the shear rate: rapid precip, wind loading, and rapid warming. These are also preconditions that favor rider triggering. So far, we've not identified slab tension as a precondition. Next, let's look to see if there is slab tension associated with terrain features. Because the snowpack creeps faster on the steep slope below a convexity than on the shallow slope above, the snowpack will stretch on the convexity. The stretching of the upper snowpack indicates the stress on the convexity includes a component of tension, which is probably more or less parallel to the slope. However, this stretching is so slow, the stored elastic energy, which would give the upper snowpack the potential to spring back, is negligible. Soil slopes and glacier ice sometimes exhibit ductile cracks at convexities, that is, cracks that open slowly. But dry slabs do not, even at terrain features like convexities. However, lower on a uniform steep slope, the creep rate will be similar at various locations on the slope, so tension is negligible where the crack in the weak layer starts. Once the crack propagates, the avalanche is a done deal. Wait, did I just say rider triggering was more likely on the steep slope below a convexity than on the convexity? Yes, the intensive studies by von Tobel, Harvey, and others with high-resolution DEMs have shown that the frequency of rider triggering increases with slope angle. In avalanche accidents, they did not find frequent triggering on convexities. The eye-catching crown fracture often occurs where the slope is convex, but this occurs after the rider triggers a crack in the weak layer where the slope is steeper. On convex slopes, the steeper is below the convexity. In general, it helps to separate triggering the crack in the weak layer from the crown fracture. Of course, during ski cutting, avalanche professionals often trigger avalanches at convexities, so triggering the crack in the weak layer and the crown fracture ideally occur at the same place. Not convinced that triggering the crack in the weak layer and the crown fracture are separate stages? Check out this video that Ron Simonhaus and I put together in 2021. While making this video in 2022, Grant Statham noticed we were identifying the start of the avalanche inconsistently.
Avalanche practitioners and researchers seem to have different ideas about where the avalanche starts. Avalanche researchers identify the start as the failure initiation, which happens underfoot and is something that we can't see, and that often happens downslope of where the actual crown fracture occurs. Whereas practitioners, myself included, I associate an avalanche starting with where the crown occurs. Once that fracture line happens, the avalanche is off and running. That's the last stage of a scientific view of avalanches starting, but it's the first stage for a practitioner.
Now, let's get back to creep on snow slopes. Deformation of the creeping snowpack is at least 100 times too slow to produce the elastic energy and brittle cracks that release avalanches. And gliding is also too slow. But could the slow extension on convexities, etc., contribute to a failure in the weak layer? Well, cold lab studies by Reiviger and others have convincingly shown that it is shear that causes damage and the initial failure to grow. The model of the spring and syringe show that fast loading and deformation produce elastic energy. How does this apply to the release of dry slab avalanches? The crown fracture is a result of tension and elastic energy in the slab, which are the result of the propagating crack in the weak layer, which quickly loads the slab near the crack tip. A shooting crack is a brittle crack caused by a propagating crack in the weak layer. The propagation of a human-triggered collapse in a weak layer, often accompanied by a whoomph sound as air is forced out of the weak layer. The collapse causes bending in the slab that stops at a brittle crack through the slab. Shooting cracks and the perimeter crack of a whoomph are first cousins, both caused by a propagating crack in a weak layer, which is always fast enough to create elastic energy and tension in the slab.
Are you still not convinced that the crown failure is caused by weak layer crack propagation? Well, Ned Baer built on some previous research and ideas from Dave Gauthier and looked at the feather-like features that create patterns on avalanche crowns. Understanding these patterns allows you to determine the direction of crack propagation. His finding that crowns crack from the bed surface upward to the snow surface provides additional convincing evidence that the tensile crack that creates the crown is a result of weak layer crack propagation. In addition, Ron Simonhaus has recently investigated a slope scale crack propagation using advanced video magnification techniques. These techniques allow him to detect snow surface disturbances that can only be associated with weak layer cracking in videos of human-triggered avalanches. As you can see, the weak layer cracks long before the crown. This is further evidence that the tensile crown is caused by a propagating crack in the weak layer.
The saw cut in the propagation saw test and the propagating crack in any instability test are also fast enough to produce elastic energy in the slab, which can drive the crack tip ahead in the weak layer. The fracture through the slab that sometimes occurs in propagation saw test are the result of the saw cut and often limited propagation ahead of the saw cut. Both the saw cut and crack in the weak layer are fast enough to cause elastic energy that drives the brittle crack through the slab. So, brittle tension cracks through the slab are always caused by a brittle crack propagating in the weak layer. Areas of tension, such as convexities, can contribute to the location of the crown fracture, but not to whether or not a slab avalanche occurs. So let's sum up the key points. Research shows faster shear contributes to the initial failure for natural slab avalanches. Recent research also shows that shear and/or collapse in the weak layer under human triggers can create a crack of critical length. That is, a crack that propagates in the weak layer. Rapid loading by precipitation or wind will increase the creep and hence the shear rate in the weak layer. This will shorten the critical crack length, favoring avalanche release, including triggering by riders. We don't need slab tension to explain how rapid loading contributes to dry slab avalanche release. While a few areas of limited slab tension likely exist at terrain like convexities, convexities are not where failures and cracks in the weak layers usually start. Terrain features such as convexities can contribute to the location of the crown fracture, but not to whether or not a slab avalanche occurs. Modern models and theory of slab avalanche release only show elastic energy and associated slab tension once a crack starts to propagate in the weak layer. So, at the stages that determine whether a rider triggers an avalanche, it is the stress under the rider and not slab tension that cracks the weak layer and starts propagation. However, at these latter stages, that is, when the crack is propagating in the weak layer, slab tension plays a key role. It drives the brittle crack in the weak layer and the tensile crack through the slab that forms the crown. There are a couple of perceptions that, early in our careers, caused us, and likely other avalanche practitioners, to think that slab tension is a snowpack precondition that favors the release of dry avalanches. First, there is slow stretching due to tension where the snowpack glides, on glaciers, and on soil slopes at convexities. Second, when a brittle crack propagates in the weak layer on a convex slope, the crown fracture, which is a tensile crack through the slab, tends to occur at the convexity. Third, the brittle crown fracture, which is caused by tension in the slab, grabs our attention. It screams tension. Also, when professionals are ski cutting, they're trying to trigger a slab avalanche with the tensile crown fracture at their skis. A slab fracture upslope of their skis is scary, sometimes engraving the propagating tensile crack into their memory. So, although these sources of tension are not preconditions for dry slab avalanche release, the intense experiences with crown fractures in the real world are far more memorable than a research paper or a video like this one. The survey showed a cluster of responses in which avalanche practitioners used the term slab tension to describe reactivity or a trend toward reactivity or favorable conditions for reactivity.
I think the tension that the researchers are describing in this piece is a lot different than the tension that practitioners are trying to describe in the survey. The researchers are describing a late stage instant phenomenon that occurs just before we get a crown fracture. And so that's part of the failure sequence of the avalanche, whereas the practitioners are trying to describe a feeling that they have in the snow when they can tell that it's getting stiffer, that they know they're going to trigger an avalanche easier than they could earlier. And that is also valid, but I don't think it's tension. It's more just the properties of the slab.
Here is the sensitivity scale of the conceptual model of avalanche hazard. Are some practitioners using the term slab tension to fill a terminology gap between stubborn and reactive? Some people have argued that the jump from stubborn to reactive is too big. I'm not sure we need a new level on the sensitivity scale, but let's explore the idea. Should the new level be labeled almost reactive or borderline reactive? Regardless of whether a new level on the sensitivity scale is a good idea, what do you think about terms like borderline reactive? Of course, Rather than summarizing the conditions with terms like borderline reactive, we can report the basic observations: cracking at skis, shooting crack, mushrooms releasing. For the feel that some practitioners associate with slab tension, we can report cohesive, slabby, or borderline slabby. The snow in this photo shows the first signs of slabbiness. Since snowpack instability tests help us interpret sensitivity to triggers, here's a column for the extended column test. Colin Zacharias, and likely others, have developed a more general column for snowpack instability tests. So, while we've argued that slab tension is the wrong term to describe conditions that are borderline reactive, we could use your help to better summarize the conditions that many of us have called tension in the slab. So that we can have a discussion, please post your perspective and thoughts about slab tension in the comments below. And thanks for putting up with all the cheesy animations and making it to the end of this video.